Karen, thank you for joining us today. Jim, thank you. As always, it's a pleasure to be back for our continuing series of conversations with Dr. Jim Arieti. Today, we're joined by Karen Cabell, a former student of Jim's, graduate of the class of 2007 from Hampden-Sydney. And I wanted to kick off today's conversation with just some, I guess, as always, a kind of very basic question. And when you think about something like war, it's this complex thing, right? That on any given day, it's seen as a failure of human reason. I think it was Steinbeck who said, as others, as this, the pinnacle of human sacrifice and bravery. So as you just reflect on your thoughts on this topic here, and I'll start with you and then pass it to Jim. When you think about the concept of war, to you, what is it?
I would say, lately the concept has been a very classically Clausewitz concept. The pursuit of politics by other means. I think there is, kind of at its simplest, a breakdown of diplomatic attempts or other political means by which to attempt to avert or avoid conflict. But I think if you look at a lot of the things going on the world stage today, especially with things almost, in a way, I think we have this return of like the Cold War and some of the geopolitical activities that, one would have suspected to see in the 80s and 90s, but not so much in, 2020. I think there is this undertone of it's a very politically driven activity. It is something short of, all out war, in the vein of World War II or, something like that. So, right now I've got a very Clausewitzian definition kind of banging around in my head, but I think it's a very fluid concept, and in a flash it turns from that into something that is very different. Thinking like Sun Tzu or someone else who has done a beautiful job of talking about the topic. So it's also very fluid in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Jim, maybe I'll pose a question to you from in the view in antiquity. Let's just start there. Maybe what was war? What was its essence?
I suppose that you're using war in its more literal rather than a more metaphorical sense. Mm-hmm. So there would be the conflict between regimes, between one state and another. Mm-hmm. That's what it would be. Conflict and a violent conflict between one state and another, because it's possible for states to have peaceful conflict, as in, and what we call trade wars, but they're not really wars except by metaphorical extension. And that's why I wanted to be clear that you're using it in its in the sense where synonyms would be military and violent and death and destruction in the physical world.
Jim, this idea that Steinbeck had that when war comes, it's because human beings have failed in some way. Was that an ancient view as well, or was it just considered to be something that was just part of human existence?
I think that you are asking it as an either or, but it isn't, those aren't the only possibilities. It clearly isn't, from the ancient point of view, a sign of failure when the war is, as most wars were in pagan times, wars of greed and conquest. There, if, say, a country like Babylonia or Persia regime wanted to expand its power and get more loot, then they would conquer the surrounding countries. And if they succeeded in getting a bunch of slaves and a bunch of loot, and they took over the land, then that war was not a failure for them. It was a success. You can only think of that kind of a war if it was a failure of the human capacity for reason, of realizing that justice and being content with what you have is the better way and is a more rational way to live. But from the point of view of those imperialist powers, a war of conquest in which you succeeded was a complete success. And I think that would go for the British Empire too, and for the American wars of imperialism, when we took over, fought the Native Americans and took over their lands and killed them all willy-nilly. From the American point of view, that would have been a success. What was the or in your, it was either a failure or what was the other thing that you said?
Sometimes you read about that the war is just one of those things that it's
that it's a part of human nature.
Right.
Well, I think that is not, I wanted to object to that too, because I believe, as both of you did at least at one time, that the distinguishing quality of human beings is reason, and to solve its disputes by means of reason rather than by fighting is the way of human beings. So I think that if you, for example, offend me in some way and I take a baseball bat and beat you to death, I have not acted rationally. And it is a violation of my human nature. It's not something, it's not the kind of way I ought to behave. It's not something that will always occur. I mean, there are some things which we can't avoid, like going to the bathroom or eating. Those are part of our instincts as animals, but there's no aggression built into human beings necessarily. Those kinds of things are taught, and they don't have to be taught. So I disagree that it's the way human beings always will be by nature. I disagree with that very strongly, because I accept the view that human beings are rational animals capable of love and settling things peacefully.
So Jim, you don't think that, as a lot of writers have said, that there is this dark side of humanity that everybody, or at least a lot of people, carry around, and that's
Well, could you give an example of what you mean by this dark side that makes people fight?
Well, the guy who James R. Martin, that's one of his sort of beliefs, right? That all human beings carry.
What's an example of that?
Well, there have been experiments where, the Stanford experiment, where people are put into certain conditions, and then they soon begin to, it's Lord of the Flies, begin to turn on each other, and suddenly this thing which is kind of comes out.
But the Stanford experiment, not all of the people were willing to let the electricity go up and electrocute somebody. Some of them were. And in the Lord of the Flies, those were children. They hadn't yet reached their telos, their end. They hadn't yet fulfilled their nature as human beings. So I denied both of those examples, and I deny that just because many people speed doesn't mean that it's necessary for them to do so by nature, or because a lot of people cheat at cards or golf or anything. that it's human nature to cheat. That seems to me an erroneous argument.
Karen, let me pose a question to you. You're a Marine officer, former Marine officer. Do you think there are people who it's in their nature to create war, or at least to want it in some basic sense?
I think as an extension to what Dr. Arieti just said, I think there is this concept that there is this, animalistic side to human beings. Whether you want to characterize it as a failure of reason or, a baser instinct as, an animal. I do think that there is the capacity for humans to, do some very evil things. In Iraq, we were having an issue in which the local insurgents were basically, by various means, having children throw, grenades and things at our vehicles, and it was kind of a twofold plan. It was, if they were successful in throwing something, they're potentially, maiming, killing, U.S. or coalition forces. And if they were unsuccessful and, we retaliated or attempted to prevent that from happening, by shooting at children, they, potentially have propaganda material of, video and pictures to use to grow their cause and, damage our image and standing with the local populace. And through that process, I couldn't fathom how a reasonable, rational human being could make that choice to, ask that of a child or to, otherwise force a child into doing that, or, having a family do that. Conversely, there were times that, I can think of when I'm a convoy commander and, trying to get Marines and sailors and, materials from one place to another safely. I very much had a kind of animalistic mentality or focus or, frame of mind where a lot of things were very instinctual. I wasn't really thinking through or reasoning through a problem like you would if you were, say, playing chess or, some other competitive capacity. I think there is that animalistic capacity for humans to, stalk, hunt, do those things that you would think of, with you were watching footage on National Geographic of, say, a bobcat stalking a deer, or some other type of nature scene where someone's trying to kill or avoid being killed. So I I agree in the sense that, there is that capacity there, but I do attribute it to a baser instinct and something that's not inherently human when it's being done.
Karen,
Well,
oh, Jim, go ahead, please.
well, I think it's clear that human beings have the capacity to be cruel and to act in savage ways, but we wouldn't say of somebody who told his child, go out and throw a bomb, or go and destroy yourself and a bunch of soldiers. It's hard to believe that a parent who would do that truly wanted what was best for his child and was acting in a rational way. I think that Kieran was completely right when he says it's not possible to think that that's a rational action. But we do have the capacity as human beings, even when we become enraged, which is, a rage and anger and this kind of visceral response to provocation is something that starts in Homer. The very first word of the Iliad, which is a poem which takes place during a horrible war and in the 10th year of a very long war, certainly by ancient standards, where sometimes wars were decided in a day or two. But the very first word is rage, and that's what it's the rage of Achilles, and it was an uncontrollable rage, and it is a poem that really the lesson is that you need to act with self-restraint. You are going to be subject to rage. The Greeks were horrible in that war. They so frequently exceeded the bounds of self-restraint, and it wreaked havoc on them. Homer's lesson is that we should not behave like Achilles. He didn't bring glory to himself in that battle. He was a disgrace. He betrayed the standards of chivalry that he had exhibited earlier in the flashbacks that Homer also provides us with. And so, although we have the capacity, to react with fury, we also have the capacity to be rational. And I would say that as Kieran has, that the human way is to behave rationally. An animal can't really do that. An enraged animal can't say, I'm going to act with self-restraint. It just goes and kills and eats. But human beings have the power to overcome their instincts. But the instincts of rulers, I'm now moving back to ancient times, who made all the wars until around the second century, were all of the Common Era. All the early wars of antiquity were wars of conquest or loot. Even the soldiers who went to Troy, as Homer shows, the excuse was, to get back Helen. But the real reason of the soldiers was to get booty and to get glory for themselves, which were the objective ends of the soldiers. But those wars were all for greed, and the people, democracies didn't make wars because there were essentially no democracies. They were regimes by kings who wanted glory for themselves. One of the worst was Alexander the megalomaniac, or as we say, Alexander the Great, but he was really a megalomaniac. Those were all unjust wars. There were no just wars in antiquity. The whole concept of a just war starts with Cicero and the on moral duties, and he defines what a just war is. And he there says, someplace, that the way of human beings is to use persuasion as an instrument of peace. The political means is to go to court and to settle your disputes. As far as I know, the Pax Romana really was a very long peace during the Roman Empire, even though the empire was ruled by tyrants. It was a long series of peace because Rome had conquered the world, and there were no other countries who had the strength to attack it. And when there were, they defeated Rome, and Rome fell to the Huns, who were savage fighters and brutal, and didn't exercise self-restraint, and hadn't read Cicero, and didn't know that human beings negotiate rather than kill each other. And as far as I know, attempts at from about the 1900 on to establish international courts, and the first through the League of Nations and then with the International Court of Justice, have pretty much been failures. And their failures, and that's something that we could explore. Why have the attempts by rational individuals, after having fought such horrible wars as World War I, and then which was going to end all wars, and then World War II. Why have there been as many more wars since World War II, and there's so many ongoing wars now? Why haven't we learned the lessons? Those would be interesting topics. I hope that we'll get to them.
We will get to those. I wanted to go back to something that Kieran was saying, though, about his experience in Iraq. And one of the things that's fascinated me is the coexistence of irrational and rational at the same time in someone, right? So you have these stories of somebody committing this kind of atrocity in a war, and then at the same time being very good friends with their.
You mean at exactly the same time when he's committing the atrocity?
Well, you think about the movie Schindler's List, and what happened in World War II, where you would have someone who had a family, lived an ordinary life, and at the same time would leave and go do commit some terrible act, and then come home and go back into his family or into a social setting with his comrades in arms. And so the fact that the two things can coexist, Kieran, one moment you're at this animalistic state, maybe doing things that you rather not contemplate outside that moment, and that evening you're sitting around with your friends, or in some cases with family, living what looks like a normal life. For the soldier, for the fighter, Kieran, how do those things coexist?
Well, I think what's been more certainly now, in contrast to the example of Schindler's List, it's pretty uncommon for, at least from the perspective I'm going to bring, to be, at home, and then, leave and go to your job and, be doing that. So, I think it's important to understand that the context and, in examples like Iraq and Afghanistan, where U.S. forces are far from home and everything, I think there's that very important aspect of brotherly love, platonic love, so often seen in Hollywood films and everything, where they're talking about doing it for each other and not for the U.S. or whatever the trope might be. But I think there is a very real aspect where, you know, you see soldiers, Marines, and others, you know, in one moment doing very, very savage, you know, brutal things, and then, you know, the next moment, being very, you know, affectionate, for lack of a better term. And I think, you know, one of the more classic cases that, at least, you know, has been fairly fairly prominent in Afghanistan, and I think to a certain extent also Iraq, has been service members getting in trouble because of things that they're witnessing with host nation members engaging in things like pedophilia. You know, it's fairly common in Afghanistan, at least for you know, little boys to be abused, and you know, I could think of a handful of examples where you know, men and women in the Army or other services, you know, follow the rules of engagement, you know, to the letter, but then just reach a breaking point where, you know, they're seeing they're seeing their hosts, or, you know, these local, national police chiefs, you know, other leaders, just, you know, by our cultural standards, abusing children, and you know, they snap and, you know, beat them up, or you know, do other things in the name of kind of protecting that child or children, or whatever the case may be. And you know, I think when you're in that situation, there's almost this drive to, you know, maintain this human connection, to kind of root yourself and anchor yourself in, you know, a very human condition of caring, and you know, wanting to, you know, maybe counterbalance the horrible things you're doing and seeing with, you know, acts of kindness, and you know, just being a good human. And so, you know, I think that plays into that sort of concept of, you know, the human brain will do a lot of very tricky things when you're in extreme circumstances. And you know, I think that's a manifestation of it, is, you know, um, having to do things that you wouldn't normally do, or you know, violate rules that you wouldn't normally violate, or just behave in a manner that may be, you know, circumstantially contrary to what you're supposed to be doing. But you know, it's almost this this attempt to remain human, and not, you know, go, you know, all the way over to the other side of, you know, being this animal that, you know, is blindly doing things, or you know, allowing these just gross atrocities to happen. And you know, I think that works the other way too. You know, if these Nazi guards, or you know, people who are, you know, just daily engaging in these horrible things, you know, I think there's got to be this level of cognitive dissonance, or something that, you know, drives them to maintain this sense of normalcy, and disconnection between, the kind of mundane human activities of life and the just horrible things that they're doing and seeing every day. So I think there's that just drive to, in one way, shape, or form, kind of maintain that human existence amidst terrible things that are happening.
Well, I could say something on this subject, but it's a complicated story. I think that your term, for your term cognitive dissonance, I would use a divided soul, but they mean pretty much the same thing. But I don't think it's limited. It's not limited only to soldiers. Let's think of. I wanted to say something about that, but think about student athletes who do their studying, and they might be taking difficult classes in mathematics or chemistry or even Greek, and then they go out onto the sports field and they're given a pep talk by their coach to rouse up their energy and passion so that they'll play really hard. And they really, when they are in the competition, it's very intense, and they're not thinking of the other team as just regular guys who are out to have a good time. They're the enemy, and they play as hard as they can. And I think that you could also think of the guy who is a butcher or an insect exterminator, and he goes during the day and he kills animals for eating or bugs who haven't done him any harm. And then he comes home and he watches television with his children or plays with his dog. There must be some kind of divided divisions in his soul. But in the case of the exterminator or the butcher, he figures, well, these are just commodities or animals, but they're not human beings. In the case of the athletes who play with tremendous force, even not foregoing doing damage and committing fouls, they have dehumanized the other team to some degree. They're the enemy. They're not just a bunch of guys out to have a good time playing the sport. But I think that here the ancients really do have something to contribute about what you mentioned, Kieran, which is the reaction of soldiers to the pedophilia or repeated atrocities by the enemy. And then they themselves start engaging in atrocities themselves, either to get even or because they're just so enraged. That's the ancient concept that we see in Aeschylus, the first surviving Greek tragedy, of how evil begets evil. And this comes, the concept of evil begetting evil is made clear in something that I know that you read, and Carlos too, Thucydides, who looks upon war as a pathology on the body politic. It brings out the worst. It shows human nature at its absolutely most diseased. But like a disease, it has a natural progression. We talk about progress generally in our country as something positive, where the company will say progress is our most important product, but it's not always a good thing. When we talk about the progress of a disease, it means the disease is going to follow its course, and the end of the disease will be death. And that's what Thucydides shows in the history of the Peloponnesian Wars. And he shows how it corrupts the morals of everybody. And civil war is even worse. The civil war that he uses as an example of all the civil wars that were breaking out at the time of the Peloponnesian Wars is the one in Corcyra, And it only ended when all the members of one political party exterminated, killed every single person of the other political party. And he talks about the horrors that are inflicted on human nature, on the body politic, the whole regime by war, and all the work in the last 40 years now on post-traumatic stress, which shows the devastating toll that it takes on soldiers who sometimes commit atrocities and then get medals for the very atrocities that they've committed, and it shows really that human nature, or human beings, have failed. The democratic regimes in which we had placed most hope have failed. Nobody much has any hope for the tyrannical, oppressive regimes in which the goal is really a glory and money for the rulers, and everybody else can be left to fend for themselves. But the democratic regimes have failed us in not persuading the rest of the world to adjudicate disagreements, and to persuade people that greed isn't a good thing. Those wars are still being fought for the ancient reasons. I suspect that the idea of adjudication is a Western concept, and those countries which are dominated by philosophies which don't depend on reason, but some kind of intuitive sense that comes from the priest, they're not going to adopt the Western standard of justice, and that's why the international court, for some reasons, is failed. But I'm not an expert on international law, though I had a good friend who lives in Washington, whom I've spoken to, Carlos, about, whose head was head. She may be retired now, Johns Hopkins of the international law there. Anyway, that's what I had to do. But maybe we should move to some of the other subjects that you said were coming up.
Sure. I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about the role, Karen, that people who have spent a lifetime in the military or Korean military, when they leave, right, and they become civilians, and oftentimes they become politicians, or they want to be leaders. The transition, right, from the military life to the civilian life, either after some time in the military, after a career in the military, what do you think makes that successful? What do you think causes it to be a challenge? It's when people return from war and now begin to adjust to life. What do you think is the key to doing that well as you move from this environment to a quote unquote normal life?
Yeah. So I think it's probably important to preface with, I don't think that military does the transition well at any point, whether you're coming up to the end of an enlistment of 4 years, or you're retiring after 30 or 40 years. I've talked to people on both ends of the spectrum and in between that have a really hard time. So I think in a way that's kind of a rigged game in some respect. But I think for those that have done it successfully, or have not had as hard a time as some others, I think it's really important to surround yourself when you're having that transition. Surround yourself with people who have done it before. Having a really solid network of people who can help and provide a measure of guidance. Be it for helping to find a new job or mission, purpose, post-military life, or have navigated that before and can share some of the lessons learned, as it were. But really, I think a lot of it just boils down to how isolated does that person end up feeling? For someone who spends a lifetime, 30, 40 years in the military and transitions, I think, it's really hard because, they're accustomed to this, sense of formality and, people listening to what they say, and this very authoritative way of engaging with the world around them, and then all of a sudden that authority is gone, and it's really up to their wiles to manipulate or engage with people around them. And on the other side of things, where maybe you didn't spend a lot of time, but you saw pretty extreme circumstances, it could be hard to make that transition as fast as it happens. I think one of the benefits of after World War II, with a lot of the soldiers and everyone coming home, there were these very long voyages, and you didn't just fly home like you do now, right? So there was a lot of time to make that adjustment of I'm in a combat zone, a theater of war. Then you get to have some time with the people you were fighting alongside, and talk about what you're going to do when you get home, and really make that mental adjustment to being at home and not in that theater or circumstance. Now, just as fast as people used to come home from I think even probably Vietnam. When I got back from Afghanistan, just a few weeks later, my daughter was born, and a couple weeks after that, I was out of the Marine Corps and moving home, and getting ready to start my civilian job. And I was woefully unprepared for how quickly those transitions came. And I struggled a little bit as a result of not being ready, and that's kind of the default of our current military state is you may have some classes before you can get out, or whatever, but generally speaking, you can be firing your weapon in a theater of war in a literal manner of hours, be sitting stateside and looking at your family, and starting to go through that process of transitioning. So it's it's really important, like I said, to have that network of people who have done it before you and can share. I think it's also very important to have that continuation of a sense of purpose. Um, you know, be it your job, or there's just something else that you have lined up, nonprofit work, education, whatever it might be. I think it's important for folks to have that sense of purpose and be able to answer, like, why am I waking up and why am I doing this and that. But it's really stacked against people who are getting out. I have talked to a lot more folks who have struggled with that transition than I've talked to folks who have done it well or had a lot of success. So it's definitely hard.
Jim, I wanted to get your thoughts on this issue. What happens when the war is over?
Well,
Soldiers come home.
as you both know, I have no personal experience in having been a soldier in the literal sense, but our second epic poem, the Odyssey, is all about soldiers returning from home. And Homer does it with a tremendous amount of sensitivity. All the things that Kieran has said are in one form or another in the Odyssey. And in the figure of Odysseus, we see the extreme difficulty that he has reintegrating himself into his family. His son has never seen him. Odysseus was at war for 20 years, and then it took 10 years, which was certainly a long sailing home. Those six of those years he was stranded on an island with Calypso. But his son has to get used to having a father. The son is about 20 years old now, and Odysseus has to get used. He's never been a father. He only has the one son, and the son was either an infant when he was born, which I think was the case, but just a few weeks old, and he never saw him grow up. They don't recognize each other. Odysseus has a hard time saying who he is. He has a hard time meeting his father. His mother has died of grief because he was gone. He's a stranger to his wife after 20 years. It's very difficult for him to resume his marriage. And then there are all the citizens of Ithaca who are unknown to him, who have lost their king for the 20 years, and then he ends up killing the suitors, all of whom have relatives. And Homer ends the whole poem with a fairy tale kind of ending, where there's forgetfulness put on everybody, so they don't remember that Odysseus has killed their children and siblings. Also, Homer shows the thrill-seeking of Odysseus and his in particularly his soldiers, when on their way home they sack and kill people who have done them absolutely no harm just because they were there. And he shows the willfulness and disobedience of the sailors, who, now that the war is over, don't want to do anything that Odysseus says. And so they open the bag of winds, they eat the cattle of the sun. I mean, they just behave in wanton ways. We see Odysseus himself, who seeks sexual satisfaction with Calypso, and then with Circe and many other women, and so do his soldiers. That seems to be another way of acting out the pain. I know I knew General Wilson very well at Hampden-Sydney, and I spoke to him about the Odyssey at great length. In fact, an interview that I had when I invited him to the class was published in 2 installments in the Hampden-Sydney Record, and it's worth reading. And the whole class and I asked him questions about returning from war, but he returned. You know, he wasn't. He had been. He had increased in rank as he went through, but he wasn't a general for a long time when he returned from the war. People, when they retired in antiquity, when they stopped fighting, or they became politicians, they were still generals. There was never any end. If you were a political person in ancient times, you also were a general. But one thing that Kieran said, which I think was different now when soldiers go into the army and they're fighting with a bunch of people, they're not from the same town. In World War II, as we know from Bedford, where so many people died in the invasion of on D-Day, people used to come from the same village, and so they were fighting with their friends. And that's also true in the Iliad. The various places that people came from, as cataloged as described in the catalog of ships in Book 2 of the Iliad, we're all friends of each other, and that was one thing that helped ease the transition back for ancient peoples, because they were going back with people that they knew and with whom they had had the same kinds of experiences. And now with the psychotherapy and group counseling of people suffering from post-traumatic stress, you at least get to talk with people who share the same experiences with you, even if they're not from the same town. So you didn't have that kind of emotional connection that you do with your old classmates, or people from your village. Yeah, I think that the soldiers today have it worse than ever in the isolation, and not though recent attempts at counseling have certainly helped, but people come back scarred, and I don't know why we make more movies that glorify wars. If all our leaders had role models where peace was established without needing to do politics by other means, it would be much better.
Jim, because we're almost out of time, is there anything good about war?
Well, it brings out as well as the worst qualities, some of the best qualities. We see people who are courageous, though of course the war has to be just for it really to be courage rather than just mere daring. But we also see self-sacrifice, which again, if it's in a good cause, is good, but it's not a virtue to sacrifice yourself for a tyrant. Or the Stoics discuss that at great length. And it brings forth innovations and genius, and that was certainly true. The aftermath of the Persian Wars, I have to use ancient examples, but was that 50 years of intellectual greatness on the part of Athens, where they used the same rational genius that they had devised for tactics against a much greater power, the Persians, and they turned the use of reason to everything. To numbers and mathematics arose, to language and rhetoric arose, to city planning, to all the fields that we now have as separate disciplines, and that all was intellectual development from the Persian Wars.
Karen, last question to you, the same thing. anything good?
I would agree that, there's, almost in a vacuum, there's these great virtues and examples of, courage um, and humans acting very humanely in terrible circumstances. But I think it's difficult to to look at those in a vacuum and kind of let them speak for themselves. I think particularly for those who have had to do these terrible or great things, depending on where you're looking at it from. I think part of the tragedy that you would hear from any of them is that the circumstances were there for that to happen in the first place. And I I think you would have a difficult time having anyone who has been to war talk about any of those good things without also talking about the terrible price that it came with.
Karen, let's make that the last comment on this topic. One final question before we sign off. We've been doing these conversations, as you know, in commemoration of Jim's last year as an active professor full-time professor at Hampden-Sydney. Any thoughts before we sign off on your time at Hampden-Sydney with Jim, and the kinds of issues you studied and explored with him as a student?
Sure. Yeah. I think a lot about the time that I had in the classroom with Dr. Arieti, and there are plenty of circumstances that I can recall where I thought back to those conversations, and I wish that I had more life experience at the time, and some context by which to have gotten deeper into the conversations, and kind of enriched things with a wider worldview, or whatever you might call it. But I can't overstate the value that those conversations have brought to me, just going through life, being able to recall some of the lessons that I had learned, through the conversations and listening. And, I think that's one of the great things that, about Hampden-Sydney and about Dr. Arieti, in particular, is the conversations were never, down from a professor to a student. They were very human conversations, and a very, balanced, human way of engaging with each other. And I think for those reasons, a lot of the lessons and things that I learned have stuck with me all the more because I wasn't listening to some lecture. I got to engage and, ask questions, be asked questions. So, I think anyone who's had the benefit of spending time with Dr. Arieti comes out, much better for it. And I wouldn't trade those experiences for anything.
Jim, any last thoughts or memories of Kieran when he was a student?
I do. I remember him extremely well. I remember him not only in class, but I remember that he was a big organizer at Hampden-Sydney on important matters, and I remember that he brought in people from outside. He organized a conference. Maybe it was only one day, but it was on questions of homosexuality. And I remember that you brought in your father and other people. Just remind me what that one was about, because I was a spectator there, but I participated in the discussion of homosexuality.
Yeah, the one where I brought my dad in, it was I believe that was an ethics like seminar or conference, and his contribution was more on the business ethics standpoint, but I believe through the conversation we also talked about ethics in war. Obviously he was in the Marine Corps as well, so.
Well, that's what I was remembering about Kieran, that he was an excellent organizer. He not only organized it and got everybody there, but he moderated them, and he did so with tact and grace. And I have those memories of him. But I don't want you to forget to bring Laura on for her cameo appearance. I've never met Mrs. Cobell.
Well, before that happens, I'll go ahead and sign off. Kieran, thank you.
But Carlos, I did want to, maybe you could stop the recording, but I wanted to ask you a question.